All right, so let's talk about cavitation. Cavitation is impingement on the surfaces, the interior surfaces of the pump, on the impeller. That impingement is damage that destroys the pump, right? It doesn't work as well as it should and can eventually eat away metal even. So what is cavitation? Well, if you've been boating and you've seen a propeller in the water, the propeller churns up little bubbles, right? And you see it in the movies. You see it in the submarine movies, Hunt for Red October or whatever. And the propeller's going through the water and all these bubbles are trailing off the prop. That's cavitation. Cavitation is vapor bubbles. Now, it's different than boiling. Boiling is heat is added to a fluid until the vapor bubble forms. Because it's at saturation pressure, right? It's at saturation temperature for that pressure. And then that bubble goes up and either the whole fluid's at that temperature and the bubble can go all the way to the top, or just the bottom of that pan is at that temperature and the vapor bubble goes up and then collapses. The collapsing of a vapor bubble is the cavitation. But once again, the difference between boiling and cavitation is that with boiling, we're adding heat for a given pressure. If I'm boiling something in my pan, I'm heating the water up to 212 degrees Fahrenheit because that's the saturation pressure, saturation temperature for atmospheric pressure. With cavitation, we're not messing around with the temperature. Temperature is whatever the temperature is. What we're messing around with is the pressure, and we can lower that saturation pressure, right? As the pump's spinning, the suction of a pump, the reason a pump works is because pressure is lower at the suction, which draws fluid in. Well, if there's not enough fluid there, or the pump's running and spinning too fast, then it can lower pressure below the saturation pressure for that temperature. I hope that makes sense. And once that fluid is below saturation pressure for that temperature, it's now effectively boiling, but the only difference is we didn't add heat, we just lowered pressure. So it's now boiling. And those bubbles start moving through the pump a little bit, and a pump adds pressure, right? Where it's converting kinetic energy of the rotor to flow energy of the fluid, and that pressure, the discharge pressure on the pump, is going to be higher than that saturation pressure. And so those bubbles are moving through, and then they collapse. Now, when a bubble collapses, if it collapses in the middle of the fluid, it just collapses uniformly, no issue. But if it collapses near a surface, right? If this bubble's cruising along here and it collapses right next to a surface in the pump, then the forces that are acting on that bubble are uneven. And what it does is it creates little microjets. And I will add a paper I read. I was looking for what kind of numbers, right? I've heard numbers like 100 times, 1,000 times higher velocities, increased pressure, whatever, right? I'll load that in there, but I'm going to go with the at least 100 times the pressure. So if it's at 100 pounds per square inch, then it can create that micro bubble. The collapsing of a micro bubble can create a pressure 100 times 100 pounds. And that collapsing bubble, right, it impinges on the surface of the impeller and erodes it away. Now, cavitation doesn't just happen in pumps. In fact, you're going to find some really cool images if you Google cavitation and dams. Anytime you have moving fluid, and for whatever reason, whether you're sending it through a venturi or down a slope, where anything that velocity goes up, pressure goes down, right? So a dam. the Grand Coulee Dam, the Glen Canyon, oh, that was a big one. The Glen Canyon Dam, let's talk about that one. They have these spillways, and the spillway, they have water that shoots down the spillway. Well, way back in the 40s, they were designing these dams with spillways that were super steep because they didn't, they're like, it'll be fine. Well, the surface of these spillways has micro imperfections on it, right? It's not a perfectly polished surface, and so it causes some turbulence. And any of that turbulence, as the fluid is moving over it, think of it as 1/2 of a venturi, right? If I've got a bump and this fluid's moving over it, the fluid speeds up and pressure goes down as it passes over that micro bump. And as you get more and more of those, you're inducing higher velocities, lower pressures, and eventually you get some little tiny bubbles forming as the water's coming down, and then the bigger bubbles, and then more bubbles, and then you get bigger bubbles. And eventually, when you're going to come down to a part on that spillway where it starts to level out, and that means the velocity of the fluid's going to go down and the pressure's going to go back up. And so those vapor bubbles or vapor bubble are going to suddenly collapse. And all that 100 times higher pressure is going to impinge. And you'll see pictures, I think it was the Glen Canyon, it was like 13 meters wide, 8 meters deep, something like that, one of the dams. I'll find some of the examples and load them into the module. But yeah, it's incredible. It's incredible how much damage can be caused by cavitation. And then cavitation, of course, we are worried about not just the discharge of the pump, but also the suction of the pump. We have to make sure that we're not going to cause cavitation and destroy this pump, because pumps are expensive. They are a little fun to rebuild. My time in the Navy as a mechanic on submarines and mechanic in the engine room, so for nuclear power plants, I got to rebuild more than a couple pumps. If you have any questions, let me know. I hope you have a great week. Before you can understand why cavitation is, no, that's not it.